recording.
Okay, well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining. We will get started. So, like always, just a few housekeeping tasks and reminders to go over first. First, please keep your microphone on mute until the Q&A portion of the webinar. If you do have questions throughout the webinar, you can type them in the chat and we will answer them. To find the chat feature in your Zoom window, look for the speaking bubble icon or the chat button. The chat defaults to all webinar participants or everyone in the to field. To send a direct message to one individual, click the down arrow after everyone and select a specific participant. Next, if you need or want captions, you can enable these by finding the CC or Show Captions button at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you do not see the CC button, look for the More button with the 3 dots. Click on the button to enable the captions. So welcome to this evening's webinar, Pickling Produce. This is the second food preservation topic in the Food Safety Foundation series. During the January, February, and March webinars, we set the stage for food preservation by discussing pathogens that can contaminate food and cause foodborne illness, what pathogens need to grow and how your actions can impact this growth, and then best practices for a thorough sanitation routine. In April, we reviewed a variety of equipment needed for food preservation methods with an emphasis on how these contribute to the safety of your value-added and preserved foods. Then in May, we discussed making preserved fruit spreads like jams and jellies. So in case you were unable to join us for one of those previous webinars, Lauren is sharing a link in the chat to our playlist on our YouTube channel. So I am Amy Johnston and I am tonight's speaker. I'm a regional educator with the University of Minnesota Extension on our food systems team, specifically working in the area of food safety. Also with us today is Lauren Backus, who is here to assist with any technical difficulties. You can direct message Lauren in the Zoom chat if you're experiencing any problems. She'll also be sharing links and other information in the chat throughout the webinar. So let's dive in. We have a pretty full agenda today, so I won't be pausing for questions until the end. So we will start by identifying different types of pickled produce products. We'll dig into the key components of pickled products that impact safety and quality and highlight some pathogens of concern. We have a series of short videos that will demonstrate preparing and canning a batch of bread and butter pickles using a water bath canner. And lastly, we'll talk about safe recipes and recipe development. So whether you're joining us to benefit your food business or you just want to learn more, I hope you leave this webinar with increased confidence in your ability to prevent foodborne illness. At the end of this webinar, you'll be able to identify safe recipes and procedures for pickling produce, be able to confidently and safely pickle produce at home, and be able to talk to your customers about the safety of your products. And as always, you'll leave with resources and know how to access additional resources after the webinar. So what are pickled produce foods? And why would we want to do this? So pickling produce provides us a way to preserve more than just cucumbers. We can preserve all sorts of vegetables and fruits. And there's kind of 5 different types of pickled produce. There's brined or fermented pickles. So that's the image you'll see in the middle. So brined or fermented pickles are produce that's cured in a brine, which is a salt and water solution, for 3 or more weeks. Once that fermentation is complete, the final product is stored in a sealed container in the refrigerator. It's not canned and heat processed with a canner or any other type of treatment, because that would inactivate that good bacteria that we need for fermentation. So brined fermented pickles need to be kept in the refrigerator for safety. Refrigerator pickles, which is the image of the sliced radishes in the flip top jar that you'll see on the screen. So refrigerator pickles can be any kind of produce that is covered with a boiling pickling liquid, put in a jar, and then put into the refrigerator. So refrigerator pickles are not canned and processed. So again, they're not shelf stable because they're not having that heat treatment. So they need to be kept in the refrigerator for safety. For a quality standpoint, let them sit in the refrigerator for at least a week before eating. So I do refrigerator pickling quite frequently at home when I have, just a half of an onion left, or I have way too many radishes, because it's for me, it's really quick and easy to mix up that pickling liquid and then just put stuff in the refrigerator. Then there's fresh pack pickles. So that's the third image on the screen. So fresh pack pickles are sometimes called quick process pickles because they're not fermented. So remember, our fermented pickles can take up to 3 or more weeks. So our fresh pack pickles are produce that are covered with that boiling pickling liquid, canned and processed with a heat treatment. So that would be with a boiling water bath canner or an atmospheric steam canner. So that's going to make them shelf stable. So fresh pack pickles may be brined before pickling. Brining can be wet, so using that salt water solution, or it can be dry, just coated in salt for a period of time. So examples of fresh pack pickles could be your cucumber pickles like you see on the screen. Otherwise, things like pickled carrots, green beans, artichokes, pickled peppers, cauliflower, beets, and asparagus. All of those vegetables can be pickled and then heat processed to make them shelf stable. So be very mindful of certain recipes you might see online. Many recipes on blogs or websites could use the words quick pickling when they're describing a recipe, but that is not the same as our fresh pack pickles, which are also sometimes called our quick process pickles. So those websites or those blogs that use the terminology quick pickling, many of them don't include the canning and processing or that heat treatment step. So those would not be shelf stable. So what they're really referring to are those refrigerator pickles. So be very mindful when you're looking at a recipe. The next category is fruit pickles, which can be whole or cut fruit that's simmered in an acidic syrup, then canned and processed with that heat treatment. The syrup might be spicy or it can be sweet and sour, and it's always made with some kind of acidic component like vinegar or lemon juice. Some examples are spiced apple rings or crab apples, pickled cantaloupe, pickled watermelon rinds, just to name a few. And then the last is relishes and chutneys. So relishes and chutneys are chopped produce that are cooked with seasonings in a vinegar solution. So examples can be an apple relish, corn relish, chow chow, your typical cucumber relish, pepper relish, or even like an apple tomato chutney. So there's a lot of different recipes out there. But what all of these kind of pickled produce foods have in common is 4 components. They have a produce. There's an acid component, there's salt, and then there's water. Before we begin to talk about the components of in pickled foods, let's just define a few terms so everybody's on the same page because you may or may not be familiar with them. So pickling is the process of treating a food with an acidic liquid. So that's usually vinegar or lemon or lime juice to extend its shelf life. So pickling increases the acidity of that food by, by lowering the pH. Acidified foods are another way to refer to pickled foods. So these acidified foods have that acid added to them to increase their acidity or lower that pH. Brine. So brine is using salt to impact the water content in a food. There's two types of brining that can be used when making pickled produce. So wet brining is that use of the salt water solution. In wet brining, the produce is soaked in the solution until there's an equal distribution of water and salt throughout the food and the solution. A wet brine is used when fermenting cucumbers. Dry brining is the use of salt to draw out water from a food. In the example you'll see later in this webinar, when we're making the bread and butter cucumber pickles, the cucumber slices are coated in salt and then let to sit. This draws water out of the cucumbers and that then increases the crispness of the produce. Hot pack, the produce is heated or cooked in the pickling liquid before filling the jar. So the jar is filled with both hot produce and hot liquid. In most cases, produce is cooked in the pickling liquid for about 2 to 5 minutes, but that can vary. This is the preferred method for firm or dense produce because it helps to heat the food to get that acidification process started. The heating will help that acid liquid go in and out of the food. Heating also removes air from inside the food, so it shrinks, so more will fit into the jar. For canning, the boiling water or steam canner is heated to 180 degrees Fahrenheit to start and then brought up to the processing temperature. Raw pack, the produce is not heated or cooked before filling the jar. So the jar is filled with raw produce and then the hot pickling liquid is added. So a raw pack is useful for produce that's going to lose its shape or color if it was cooked before pickling. So for example, pickled asparagus, pickled green beans, pickled onions, those are all examples of produce that are raw packed because if we were to cook those first, they would have color changes or texture changes. So for canning, the boiling water bath or the steam canner are heated to 140 degrees Fahrenheit to start, and then the temperature is brought up to the processing temperature. And the reason why we start at a lower temperature in a raw pack is because the food needs more time to come up to temperature, and then also so that there's nothing shocked, so the jars don't crack or anything like that because there's cold product in there. In the past, raw pack was sometimes called cold pack, but that terminology isn't used anymore and it has been updated. And then lastly, equilibrium pH. That's the final pH of both the food and the pickling liquid after 24 hours. So for a safe product, we're looking for that equilibrium pH of 4.6 or below. So pickled produce will always have those four components of produce, acid, salt, and water. The quantities and the ratios will differ depending on the type of produce. Other components that can be added include sugar, spices or herbs, and firming agents. Sugar is used to balance the tartness of that acidic ingredient, spices and herbs for flavoring, and the firming agent is an optional addition. And we'll discuss all these components in detail over the next several minutes. So for the most flavorful and crisp product, use produce that is in season. Avoid using pieces that are damaged with cracks or holes, have severe bruising, as these can be entry points for pathogens and lead to contamination. So thoroughly wash produce before using. Lauren is sharing a link in the chat about washing produce. If you're making cucumber pickles, make sure to use cucumbers without a wax coating, as this can interfere with that acidification process. And in general, for cucumber pickles, you'll need about 14 pounds of cucumbers to make 7 quarts of pickles, 9 pounds to make 9 pints. And fun fact, 1 bushel of cucumbers weighs 48 pounds, which will yield 16 to 24 quarts of pickles. So I mention this because that's illustrates a pretty big range. And that range is due to the variance in size of cucumbers. So when you're measuring out your produce for pickling, it's really important to use weight versus volume, because the size of that produce would impact your volume, but it's not going to impact the overall weight of what you're trying to get to. With pickling fruit, use slightly underripe, as these are usually a bit firmer. Using irregularly shaped or trimmed pieces of fruits and vegetables are a good way to use up those pieces in relishes and chutneys. This can also help reduce waste. Because these produce are chopped into small pieces, the original size or shape doesn't matter. And again, weighing the produce instead of using volume, it's going to really help with consistency, especially if you're having different sizes of produce. And Lauren is, oh, you already shared that. Okay, so let's do a quick refresher on acidity from the February webinar. So the pH is that measurement of acidity of a food. The pH scale is from 0, or the most acidic, to 14, the least acidic, also called alkaline or basic. And right there in the middle is 7, which is neutral. So distilled water is right there at 7, that neutral. Acidic or acidified foods have a pH of 4.6 or less, and then low acid foods have a pH of greater than 4.6. And again, that 4.6 is that benchmark that we're aiming for our pickled produce foods, because that's going to help prevent the growth of any pathogens. So the acid or the acidic component of pickling is usually vinegar, but it can also be lemon or lime juice if you're making pickled fruits or chutneys. When using vinegar, use white distilled vinegar or cider vinegar that is a 5% acidity. The acid in vinegar is acetic acid, and research has shown that using a 5% acidity vinegar for pickling produces a safe and a quality product. You can see the yellow arrow on the screen by the distilled white vinegar. So that's just showing you one place to look for on a vinegar label for that acidity content. So it might say something like 5% acidity or 5% acetic acid. In the past, a range of 4 to 6% acidity was recommended for use. However, there is risk associated with using a vinegar of 4% acidity or less. as the final product may not reach that equilibrium pH of 4.6 or below. And then vinegars with an acidity greater than 5% might cause undesirable texture or taste in the final product if used when pickling foods. So that's the research has now shown the 5% acidity, it produces that safe product. You might also see some types of vinegars that are 10% or more acidity, and those would not be well suited for use in food. They might have other uses. Distilled white vinegar or cider vinegar usually has a pH between 2.0 and 3.4. So again, low pH, very acidic, which we need to get that equilibrium pH of our produce. Do not use homemade vinegars for pickling and canning unless the percent acidity has been measured. And that's because you don't know if it is that 5% or more or less. Also avoid using balsamic vinegar or red wine vinegar, even if they have that 5% acidity, because of the impact that they could have on the color of the produce after processing. Lemon or lime juice might be an ingredient in pickled fruits or chutneys, and those usually have a pH between 2.0 and 2.6. So while there's not a standard ratio of how much vinegar to use per pound of produce, it's because the natural pH of produce varies, and reaching that equilibrium pH is also impacted by the type of the produce, if it's starchy or not, how it's processed, if it's a hot pack or a cold raw pack, a raw pack, and the processing time. All of those things impact how the pH of that produce changes. So vegetables are low acid, which means they have a pH of greater than 4.6. And the majority of fruits have a pH of 4.6 or less, so they're acidic. Lauren is sharing a link to a list of common food pHs from Clemson University. Again, there's not a standard ratio of acid to produce for pickling to reach that 4.6 or below. Again, reaching that 4.6 or below is impacted by many factors. So tested recipes have that proportion figured out or calculated. So if you're developing your own recipe, you'll need to test the final equilibrium pH of that food, and we'll discuss that in more detail towards the end of the webinar. So salt plays a couple different roles in pickling. It helps with the texture when we're using it in brining, and then it also helps with flavor. So salt is important in osmosis. During osmosis, water molecules will move from an environment with less salt to an environment with more salt in order to balance that solution. As the water molecules move in and out of the cells of the produce, they're going to take other ingredients with them. So that's what's going to help change that pH of the produce. So for pickling, use canning or pickling salt. These salts don't contain added compounds like iodine or anti-caking agents like calcium, which can make the brine cloudy. So don't use kosher salt or sea salt. Again, those can have some added compounds that can make the brine cloudy, but also their weight and volumes differ from brand to brand depending on the size of the crystal. And the measurements in the tested recipes are based on the canning or the pickling salt. You'll see on the screen, I also included a label from a sea salt that's being marketed as okay for pickling and canning. And you can see the ingredients say Pacific sea salt. And while it is safe to use, sea salt in pickling, again, it could have that impact on clouding the brine, or maybe changing the taste a little bit, depending on what other compounds are present in that salt. There are recipes for reduced or no sodium pickled foods. So it's important, though, to note that those recipes are going to be for your fresh packed pickles, not our fermented pickles. And our fermented pickles, they need to have that salt water brine solution in order to create that good environment for the good bacteria to grow. So fermented recipes are going to have that salt, and you should not adjust the salt in those fermented pickles. And then lastly, salt substitutes can be used, excuse me, but they may result in a metallic taste when processed. So just be aware of that if you make that kind of substitution. Excuse me. And then water is needed for the pickling liquid. Soft water is best compared to harder water, as hard water can contain minerals that, again, can cause a cloudiness in the brine, and they might have an impact on the final texture of the pickled produce. So if you do have hard water, you can boil the water for 15 minutes and then let it stand for 24 hours. During that time, any minerals or sediment will fall to the bottom of the container you have the water stored in. And then you can just ladle out the water that you need. If you don't want to do that, you can use distilled water or any kind of commercially bottled water. So now let's move into our optional components. So sugar can be added to pickling liquid to offset the bitterness of that vinegar or the tartness of that lemon or lime juice. So some pickling liquids have a much larger proportion of vinegar so that sugar is added to help with that flavor of the final product. So white and brown granulated sugar are the most commonly used. You can substitute honey. If you do substitute honey, substitute 1 cup of granulated sugar for or with 3/4 cup plus 1 tablespoon of honey. So it's not an exact 1-to-1 ratio, just because of the sweetness of honey. So for those of you that attended the May webinar about making jams and jelly, we spent a lot of time about the importance of sugar and its role with water activity. The sugar is not having that function when we're talking about pickling foods. So you can omit sugar from a pickled recipe if you don't want to have that added sugar, and just know that you might have a tartar final product. If you're going to substitute a sugar with a sugar substitute, either one that provides calories or not, just make sure it is one that is heat stable because of the canning and the processing. And then spices and herbs are used in pickled produce to enhance that flavor. So whole and fresh spices or herbs really provide the best flavor, but some recipes are going to call for dried varieties. So the example that we'll see in a little bit of the bread and butter pickles, that called for dried turmeric, because that turmeric was needed for coloring, to get that signature color in bread and butter pickles. So the spices and herbs can be added to the pickling liquid when it's heated, or added to the jar during a raw pack. And then firming agents are likely unnecessary if the produce that you're using is in season and fresh, and the correct proportions of ingredients are used. There's nothing wrong or unsafe with using them. We just know many customers prefer foods that have as few ingredients as possible. So some firming agents you may come across during your recipe research are pickling lime. So this is a calcium and it is used to increase the firmness of fresh pack and also refrigerator pickles. Again, it's not necessary if you're using fresh and seasoned produce. However, if you do use pickling lime, you're going to soak that produce in a lime water solution for 12 to 24 hours before pickling, and then you need to rinse and soak in plain fresh water several times to try to pull out as much as that pickling lime as possible. Alum, again, not needed in fresh pack pickles. If you're using that in season and fresh produce. There is some evidence that it does have a positive impact on the texture of fermented pickles, but again, it's not necessary. Calcium chloride, mostly kind of known by its brand name of Pickle Crisp, can be used to ensure that the texture is crisp. The granules are added to jars to fill jars before processing. Again, it's not necessary if you're using quality in-season ingredients. And then lastly, some older recipes may call for the addition of grape leaves. And these grape leaves contain tannins, and those tannins stop enzymes that can soften produce. So again, not necessary, but you can choose to use them. So when correctly prepared, pickled produce foods are non-potentially hazardous. They can be stored in a cool, dry place if they've had that heat treatment during canning. Once opened, they do need to be stored in the refrigerator. So along with safe food handling practices, these products are made safe by controlling that pH, getting that equilibrium pH of 4.6 or below, and through the heat processing in canning. The heat processing kills many pathogens that could be present on the produce that we discussed in the January webinar. So this can include things like E. coli. And the pH, controlling the pH, getting into that 4.6 or below, inhibits or prevents the toxin formation of pathogens like Clostridium botulinum. Yeast and molds, especially molds that produce mycotoxins, can be a concern in pickled foods if the product was not prepared correctly or if the jar did not seal properly during processing. So if they became contaminated, you might see mold activity at the top of the container or air bubbles moving throughout the jar. Don't sell or consume these products, but discard them as they are not safe. So now let's get into the making and processing of pickled produce. Besides what you'll need for washing and cutting or preparing the produce, you'll need the equipment listed on the screen. Just a couple quick notes. Again, a scale to weigh the produce is a really useful tool instead of measuring by volume. Again, that's going to give you consistency from batch to batch, especially when your produce is different sizes. When making the pickling liquid, do not use zinc, copper, brass, galvanized metal or iron utensils or pots because the acid can interact with these metals and cause color changes and potential leaching of compounds. So we touched on this at the beginning of the webinar when talking about the different pickled foods and reviewing definitions, but I just want to reiterate a few differences. So fresh pack pickles fruit pickles, relishes, and chutneys are canned and processed using that boiling water bath canner or the atmospheric steam canner, and that makes them shelf stable. A pressure canner is not needed because these foods are acidified and have a pH of 4.6 or less. Refrigerator pickles and fermented pickles do not receive a heat treatment and are therefore not shelf stable. So we're not going to review refrigerator pickles or the brine fermented pickles tonight. We're going to focus on those shelf stable pickled products. So pickled produce are usually in pint or quart jars. And then also the produce might be hot or raw packed. So before starting to prepare your pickled produce, spend that time understanding your recipe. Know if you're going to be using a hot pack or a raw pack and the size of your jars, because that can have an impact on the processing time. And also know your elevation. So Minnesota has an average elevation of 1,200 feet with some high points in Cook County at Eagle Mountain, but also in Southwest Minnesota, there are a few high points in Lincoln, Pipestone, Rock, Murray, Nobles, Jackson, and Cottonwood counties. So a safe recipe is going to include all of this in all of these instructions. It's going to talk about the style of pack, your processing time, and have you know your elevation. Before we start to make our pickled product, we want to sterilize our jars. So we're using our pot and inserting a perforated rack into the bottom. And that perforated rack is really important to allow for water to circulate around all the sides of the jars. We don't want any cold spots. The jars are evenly spaced. They're not touching each other. Again, that's going to allow for that even circulation of the water. Filling up all of the jars with water. And then she'll fill all the way 1 to 2 inches above the top of the jars. And again, this is because we need that boiling water to touch all the surfaces of the jars for that sterilization. So to sterilize jars, the water is brought to a boil. And then if you are at sea level, you're going to boil for 10 minutes. But because we're in Minnesota and we are at that elevation of 1,200 feet, we're going to add another minute. So we'll boil for 11 minutes. So for every additional 1,000 feet above sea level, you add an additional minute. So there she's checking. She didn't have enough water quite yet. Added more water so the jars are covered, and brought them up to a boil, and then boiled for 11 minutes. So earlier this year, I had the opportunity to work with 2 really talented master gardener food preservation consultants to film a variety of food preservation videos. And these videos are from that project. So the recipe we used in these videos are for bread and butter cucumber pickles. And these cucumbers are brined before they're cooked with the pickling liquid. So when preparing your produce, it's always important to first wash your produce and then cut as indicated in the recipe instructions. And this is because the size and the thickness of the pieces will impact that final equilibrium pH. The processing time is in the recipe is set because of or impacted by the size of the produce. This recipe called for dry brining the vegetables before pickling. So she's combining the cucumbers and the onions together, and we're using the canning or the pickling salt to dry brine. So she's thoroughly mixing, kind of gently massaging to get everything going and let that salt do its job. The produce is then covered with ice to help keep it really cold as well, and to help draw out even more water from the inside of those cucumbers and those onions. And we're doing that to get a really crisp final product. So after about 4 hours, the ice is removed, and now we're draining the produce. You can see there's quite a bit of water in the bottom of the bowl, and some of that is from the ice melt, but it's also from water getting pulled out of those cucumbers and the onions. And again, that's going to really help with a crisp final product. She's letting everything drain just even more, as we will then assemble and prepare the pickling liquid. So next we are going to make the pickling liquid. And the pickling liquid is what, oops, pardon me. Let's try that again. There we go. The pickling liquid is what we're going to cook the produce in, and then fill the jars with both the hot liquid and the hot produce. So again, this recipe called for the powdered turmeric for that coloring, that yellow color of the bread and butter pickles. So we combined the sugar and the spices, and then added room temperature water, and then begin to stir everything in the water to help get that sugar dissolving. You'll notice that we did not add additional salt, and that's because we used the salt to dry brine the cucumbers and the pickles. So that salt is already on the produce. You could add more salt if you wanted a saltier product. So this is, again, a hot pack style recipe. So we have the pickling liquid at boiling, and now we're adding the cold vegetables to that. Stirring to get everything mixed and combined. Once the liquid was brought back up to boiling, the mixture boiled for 10 minutes. So depending on the produce and the size of the pieces, the cooking time will vary. So like some produce, like carrots being used for pickled carrots, are only cooked for 4 minutes. And then, because this is a hot pack style, it was really important to keep the jars warm before filling and processing. So we just left the jars in the pot of water after they had been sterilized, turned off the heat, and they were just sitting in the pot. So carefully remove the jars and empty them. And to reduce mess, use a funnel to fill your jars, and start to fill with both the hot produce and the hot pickling liquid. So for pickled foods, we are looking for a headspace of a 1/2 inch. And that 1/2 inch is important because that's going to allow enough space for the pickling liquid to boil during the heat treatment without interfering with the seal of the metal flat lid. So there she's measuring for the headspace. Then before putting on the flat, wiping the rim to make sure there's nothing going to interfere with that seal, and then securing the flat in place with the ring. And then putting the jar back into the warm water while we fill the rest, just to keep those jars warm. That's going to help prevent any of that shocking dream processing. So again, we're filling to get up to that 1/2 inch of headspace. That 1/2 inch of headspace is needed to allow for enough room for the liquid to boil during the heat treatment and not interfere with that space. So you can see that there's too much in there. She's going to take product out instead of trying to push too much of it down. And then she'll measure that headspace again to get to that 1/2 inch. She's also trying to remove any air bubbles that could be present. You can see that the level of the food did go down slightly as she was poking the food. And now we are at that 1/2 inch of headspace. And again, very important to clean the rim of the jar to prevent anything from interfering with the seal. So you can see that there's 1 to 2 inches of water above the top of the jars. Again, very important to allow for that complete circulation of water around the jars. Once the water was brought up to processing temperature, they were processed, and now we will let them cool. So once that processing time is done, you've turned off the heat, you've let the jars start to sit, that's when you're going to start to hear that vacuum forming. So you're wanting to listen for that loud click sound. So this video is from the jams and jellies, but the sound will still be the same regardless.
Two.
So that's the sound we're looking for, that clicking, to make sure our jars are sealed. For certain pickled cucumber recipes, you might see instructions for something called low temperature pasteurization instead of using the boiling water or the steam canner for that heat treatment. And you can use that process, and it might give a firmer final product. The low temperature pasteurization does require a continuous monitoring of the temperature within a pretty narrow range for 30 minutes. So your filled jars are placed into a boiling water canner or a pot of water that is filled with water that is between 120 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit to start. Your jars are covered with enough water by at least 1 inch. Then that water is heated to 180 degrees. Once that water reaches 180 degrees Fahrenheit, it needs to be maintained at that temperature for 30 minutes. If the water temperature dips below 180 degrees, it could impact the safety of the product. And if the temperature goes above 185 degrees, it might cause softening of the produce. Use a candy or a jelly thermometer or a probe thermometer to continuously monitor the water temperature. So this method is only recommended for certain recipes, and it can't be substituted for any recipe. So here's just a chart to show you some of the differences between different types of pickled cucumber products. You'll see there's differences between the pack type, between raw and hot. And then also the processing times will vary. You'll see that the hot processing times might be a little bit shorter for some produce. Again, then the ratio of components when making other type of pickled vegetables. So again, that produce, vinegar, salt, and water is going to vary depending on that natural pH of the produce, the pack type, and the desired flavor of the final product. So for example, pickled peppers require more vinegar per pound of produce compared to pickled carrots. And this is because the pickled carrots are hot packed and the peppers are raw packed. And heating food in the pickling liquid speeds up or increases that acidification process of the food. And the texture of the carrots is acceptable using the hot pack because they're starchy and dense and firm compared to a pepper. And that pepper could get soggy if hot packed. So again, while I wish there was a cheat sheet of a ratio of produce to vinegar, it does not exist. So again, and now this is just showing you some of the differences between raw and hot packed and processing times for a variety of different vegetables. So you can see we've got our asparagus is going to be raw packed again because that could have some color and texture changes if it was hot packed. But those starchier, firmer foods like cauliflower, jicama, beets, those are going to be hot packed because they can stand up to that before processing. Making your pickled fruits, again, you might use lemon juice or vinegar or a combination of both. For pickled fruits, you might notice that the amount of the acidic ingredient is less if that natural pH of the fruit is lower. So if it's already very much below that 4.6, you might not need to use as much lemon juice or vinegar in that pickling. The majority of pickled fruits are going to be hot packed. And again, that's going to be for the final texture and then also to help with that acidification process. And you can see some of the fruits do take a longer processing time compared to the produce, or not to the vegetables. And then making relishes and chutneys, again, it's a great way to use up those irregularly shaped produce or where you have just small quantities. And most relishes and chutneys are, again, going to be that hot pack. So that produce is going to be cooked in the pickling liquid before being added to the can and then processed. Um, so just want to share a couple troubleshooting resources with you. Lauren is going to share a link to a document from the National Center for Home Food Preservation that has an entire section dedicated to potential causes and solutions for pickled foods. And then lastly, then the answer line is also another great resource to use if you're struggling with a recipe for your pickled foods. So there are recipes, tips, tricks, and hacks everywhere, when you're researching your food preservation methods. So how do you know which recipes or methods are safe? So always use those research-based recipes from the USDA, the National Center for Home Food Preservation, your extension systems, Ball publications from 1994 or later. Those are going to be based on research. What if you have a really old family recipe? You can compare that against those research-based recipes, and then also you can use the safe substitution guidelines, which Lauren will be sharing in the chat. And then if you do want to develop your own recipe, use the principles from today. Spend time understanding recipes and then test that final product pH, and then get your product and your recipe tested in a food lab. So a little bit more on developing your own recipe. Again, study those research-based recipes. Know which recipes are going to require the produce to be hot packed, because you need that heat to start the acidification process. Use your weights instead of volume for your recipe and your ingredients. That's going to help with consistency and being able to scale your recipe. Trial hot and raw pack methods to see if you're getting that final texture that you want, and test that for that equilibrium pH, which we'll discuss on the next screen. And then understand the processing times that different produce need for the different size jars. Don't underprocess your jars, because that can lead to food safety risks. So to test the equilibrium pH, you'll need a pH meter, and you'll test both the pH of the food and the pickling liquid after 24 hours. So after the food has been canned and processed, you'll wait 24 hours, you'll open up one of the jars, and then you'll test for that final equilibrium pH. And again, we're looking for it to be 4.6 or below. So to test that equilibrium pH, you'll first separate the solid food from the liquid, and it's very easy to test the pickling liquid. You'll insert your pH meter into the liquid and wait for it to give you the readout. If it is that solid food, you're likely going to have to blend it or puree it. So in this picture, it was some cucumbers, and the pickles were blended to a smooth consistency. If it's too thick, because there's not enough water left in that food, you can add distilled water to thin it out enough for the pH meter to give you a reading. Because remember, distilled water is that pH of 7, which is neutral, so it's not going to impact your pH reading. So after you've blended your food, we've added some distilled water so we can take a reading. We insert the pH meter and let it read the pH. So the 3.8 at the top number that's the pH, and then the 71.0, that's the temperature of the food. So if both the food and the liquid have that pH of 4.6 or less, you've reached that safe final equilibrium pH. If only the liquid is at 4.6 or lower, and the food is above 4.6, then that means there's something needs to change in your recipe. Either the amount of acid needs to change, the pack type needs to change. Maybe you raw packed instead of hot packed. So hot packing can help speed up that acidification process. Or maybe your size, your pieces of food were too big, so that acid wasn't penetrating all the way to the center of the food. So a variety of potential changes to the recipe. So if you're planning on selling your pickled produce products, know your regulations. So if you're a cottage food producer, knowing that you need to have your pickled produce have that 4.6 or less, and that it is properly heat processed. Using and following those safe research-based recipes, or if you're developing your own, testing that final product pH and recipe. If you're a licensed food processor, there's other criteria. You may need to work with a process authority to review your recipe and process. You'll need to register with the Food and Drug Administration. There's certain Code of Federal Regulations that you'll need to adhere to, and then you'll need to complete a Better Process Control School course. So I'll include a little bit more information of those in the follow-up email, but also we'll spend more time digging into those in the July webinar, which is about canning acidified foods. So with that, that is all that I had to share with you today. So as always, would love to hear your feedback from today's webinar. You can scan the QR code or follow the link that Lauren is sharing in the chat. Again, your responses are anonymous and they will be used to guide future programs. And then if you are interested in upcoming webinars, again, follow the link that Lauren will share in the chat, or you can scan the QR code. And again, next month, July, we'll be canning acidic foods. So we'll dive more into pH and those regulations of selling acidified foods. And with that, I know we are just 2 minutes over, and my apologies. If you are able to stay on, I will answer questions. If not, like always, I'll include answers to the questions in the follow-up email.